Imagine being on the verge of fulfilling a dream, only to be publicly humiliated for something you can't control. Arthur Weston, a simple man from the countryside, never thought his first plane trip would end in embarrassment. As he stepped into the first-class cabin of a flight from Edinburgh to London for the very first time, his old coat, carrying a faint whiff of the farm, quickly irritated the passengers. "How disgusting! This man reeks of a stable," Lady Eleanor Carrington snapped, her sharp voice dripping with disdain. She demanded that Arthur be removed. He was thrown out of first class by an arrogant millionaire, dismissed simply because he smelled like animals. But what she didn't know was who this man really was. 2 days later, both their lives would take a surprising turn. Arthur Weston, with his slow and steady steps, carried in his eyes the curiosity of someone rarely leaving the countryside. He lived on a farm deep in rural Scotland, where the scent of wet earth and hay was just a part of daily life. His simple clothes and the worn wool coat that had been with him for years told the story of a modest yet dignified life. Every step he took at the airport seemed to weigh with the surprise of it all. The vast hall, with its bright signs and the hurried pace of passengers, was something he had never seen before. It was his first time in an airport, let alone on a plane. The first-class ticket had been a gift from his son, who wanted his father to have a special experience before an important medical procedure. Arthur didn't quite know what to expect, but in his mind, he was grateful just to be there, part of something he'd always thought was far beyond his reach. While Arthur took everything in with the humble appreciation of someone who cherishes small moments, Lady Eleanor Carrington strode through the airport with the air of superiority that always accompanied her. Born into an old aristocratic family, Eleanor was used to moving in circles of wealth and influence. Her expensive dress, stylish heels, and refined perfume were all symbols of her status. She walked without glancing to the sides, without noticing the people around her. To Eleanor, the world beyond her social circles was irrelevant, and those who didn't belong to them were invisible. The flight from Edinburgh to London was just another trip on Eleanor's agenda, and she despised wasting time in airports. She loathed the chaos, the presence of ordinary people, and anything that didn't meet her high standards. To her, first class was a sanctuary of exclusivity, an escape from everything she considered beneath her. Arthur, unaware of the stark contrast he was about to experience, made his way to the boarding gate, captivated by the thought of finally being on a plane. He wondered what it would be like to see the world from above, to feel the clouds so close as if, for a moment, he might touch the sky. On the other hand, Eleanor was already growing impatient. Her gaze scanned the gate, searching for signs that she would soon be inside the aircraft, comfortably seated in her plush leather chair, far from any discomfort. However, what she didn't know was that, on this flight, a reality very different from hers would sit right beside her. Arthur Weston, with his calm and unobtrusive steps, stood in the boarding queue, admiring the large plane outside the window. For him, it all still seemed like a distant dream. The airport, with its lights and constant motion, was something he had only ever seen on television. The other first-class passengers, elegantly dressed, seemed worlds apart from his reality. But Arthur was there with the same dignity as always, even amidst the curious glances. Lady Eleanor Carrington approached with brisk steps, her face already marked with impatience. She had always hated the boarding process, and this time was no different. As she neared the queue, her gaze quickly landed on Arthur, and in a split second, her face twisted in pure disdain. The sight of this man in his worn-out clothes carrying the faint smell of the fields made her stop for a moment. Eleanor couldn't hide her indignation. "Who is that man? And what is he doing in first class?" she muttered, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. Her voice dripped with scorn, as if Arthur's presence was a personal affront. Arthur, unsure of what to do, slowly turned to face the woman. He hadn't expected such hostility, especially from someone who didn't even know him. His eyes, tired but always kind, met Eleanor's cold stare. "Excuse me, ma'am," Arthur said softly. "I'm only here because of my son's kindness. He bought this ticket for me." But Arthur's explanation didn't soften Eleanor's gaze. On the contrary, it seemed to reinforce her belief that something was amiss. She crossed her arms and rolled her eyes with evident arrogance. "This is unacceptable. The smell. It's like they've brought an entire farm onto the plane. Someone should do something about this," she said, nose in the air, as if Arthur were an inconvenience that needed to be dealt with immediately. Arthur, though feeling the weight of humiliation, tried to maintain his composure. He knew he didn't belong to the world of luxury that surrounded him, but he hadn't expected that his presence would cause such offense. He looked down at the floor, trying to hide the growing discomfort inside him, not wanting to make trouble for the other passengers. But inside, the injustice of the moment was hard to ignore. As the others in the queue watched the scene unfold in silence, the atmosphere seemed to grow more tense. Eleanor's disdain was evident, but Arthur stood firm in his humility, not wanting to retaliate with anger or resentment. He was there for an important journey and wouldn't let someone else's pride ruin a moment that meant so much to him. The boarding finally began, and Arthur walked slowly towards the plane's entrance, doing his best to ignore the discomfort Eleanor's glare had caused. When he settled into his first-class seat, he couldn't help but smile softly. The seat was spacious, comfortable, like nothing he had ever experienced before. Arthur gazed out the window, eager for the flight, feeling slightly out of place, but still grateful for the opportunity. However, his peace didn't last long. A few minutes later, Lady Eleanor entered the plane, and when she saw Arthur already seated, she stopped abruptly. She frowned, as though this was the height of disorder in her privileged world. "This cannot be happening," she muttered, looking around, expecting some staff member to notice the situation. With a look of utter disgust, Eleanor immediately called over one of the flight attendants. Without bothering to lower her voice, she said, "Something must be done. This man cannot sit here. He clearly doesn't belong. The smell is unbearable. I'm not spending hours on this flight with that." The attendant hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. He knew he couldn't just move someone without a valid reason, but Eleanor's commanding tone made it clear she wasn't asking, she was demanding. He glanced at Arthur, who, unsure of what to say, kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. "Ma'am," the attendant said in a controlled tone, "the gentleman has every right to be here. Please try to get comfortable." Eleanor was far from satisfied with this response. Her eyes narrowed, and with a sigh of exasperation, she replied, "This is unacceptable. You should have standards. I paid for this seat and expected a certain level of comfort. I demand that he be removed." Arthur lifted his head, feeling small but determined not to cause any trouble. His face was calm, but his eyes, once filled with the excitement of the trip, were now heavy with embarrassment. He knew his presence was bothering others, and that hurt him more than any words could express. In a soft, almost resigned tone, he spoke to the attendant. "Look, if it's causing such a problem, I can move to economy. I don't want to bother anyone." The attendant, visibly embarrassed by the entire situation, glanced around, unsure of how to resolve the standoff. Eleanor, on the other hand, stepped back, triumphant as if she had won a battle. Arthur then stood up, carefully removing his old coat and folding it. The weight of the humiliation seemed to spread throughout the plane. Other passengers watched in silence, some uncomfortable with the scene, others simply indifferent. He walked down the aisle to economy class, where he sat, trying to regain his dignity. Without uttering a word of hatred, Arthur felt deeply wounded inside. The trip he had so looked forward to, this experience that was meant to be special, had now become a symbol of exclusion and disdain. Yet he didn't complain. Arthur's humility, which had always been his greatest strength, now also seemed like his greatest vulnerability. From his new, tighter and less comfortable seat, he looked out the window again, but this time with a heavy heart. He had never intended to cause trouble, and it wasn't his aim to be in the middle of a confrontation. But now, all he wanted was for the flight to end quickly. Meanwhile, back in first class, Lady Eleanor relaxed in her seat, as if the balance of the world had been restored. 2 days after the flight, Arthur Weston walked through the bustling streets of central London, still reflecting on what had happened. The humiliation he had faced on the plane was a fresh wound, but he forced himself to move forward. "Nothing I can't get over," he thought, using his humility as a shield. The city felt so distant from his reality in the countryside, but he was there for a bigger reason. His son, James. Arthur was heading to a fancy cafe where he would meet James and his girlfriend, Emily. It was a sophisticated place, frequented by people who seemed to live in a world far removed from his own. Exactly the kind of place Arthur would never have chosen to be. But he felt proud. Meeting the girl his son loved was an important step, and he wasn't going to let bitter memories steal his joy. As he entered the cafe, Arthur glanced around and took a seat by the window. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, but the lively conversations and the clinking of cups contrasted with his quiet demeanor as he waited patiently. It wasn't long before James and Emily arrived, smiling and full of energy. But before he could react, the cafe door opened again, and a familiar figure appeared. Lady Eleanor Carrington, walking with her usual air of superiority. By her side was Emily, who led her over to the table where Arthur was seated. When Eleanor saw him, the shock was immediate. Her body stiffened, and for a moment she stood frozen, unable to believe what she was seeing. The very man she had humiliated on the plane, the one she'd considered beneath her, was now sitting in front of her. But not just as any stranger. He was the father of James, her daughter's boyfriend. Oblivious to the tension, Emily cheerfully introduced them. "Mum, this is James's dad, Arthur Weston." In that moment, Eleanor's world seemed to collapse. She, who had always believed in a strict divide between what she considered the superior and inferior worlds, was now forced to face reality. Arthur, with his usual calmness, stood and extended his hand to her. "It's a pleasure to meet you again," he said with a kindness that, ironically, only deepened Eleanor's discomfort. "I'm James's father." Eleanor shook his hand, but the look in Arthur's eyes unsettled her. He wasn't there to confront her, yet his dignified presence made her question her own behavior. How could she have been so arrogant? The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. She slowly sat down, the shame creeping through her defenses. Arthur, on the other hand, resumed his seat, and the conversation around them continued. James and Emily chatted about the future, but Eleanor was trapped in the past, on that flight, in that moment, in the humiliation that now haunted her in ways she could never have anticipated. The cafe was full of life, but Eleanor could only focus on Arthur. He was sitting right in front of her, radiating the same calmness he had on the plane. But now she noticed something different. It wasn't just his presence that unsettled her, it was her own conscience. "Do you remember me?" Eleanor finally asked. Breaking the silence between them, her voice was hesitant, something rare for her. Arthur looked at her, his eyes steady but kind. "Yes, I remember," he replied with no intent of causing her further discomfort. "You were on the flight to London." Eleanor felt the heat rising to her face. There was no escaping that moment. She knew what she had done, and now it all seemed even more cruel and unnecessary. The words she'd used, the tone of contempt, it all came flooding back, overwhelming her with shame. "I feel terribly sorry for what happened," she said, her voice low, almost choking. "I shouldn't have spoken like that. It was wrong." Arthur remained calm, showing no sign of resentment. He simply nodded slowly. "I believe we all have moments where we act in ways we'd rather not remember. Life gives us opportunities to be better." Those simple, unassuming words hit Eleanor like a blow. He wasn't there to judge her, or to repay the humiliation she had caused him. He had forgiven her long before she'd even apologized. The true weight of that forgiveness began to sink in, not as immediate relief, but as a painful realization of just how petty and small she had been. The transformation within Eleanor wasn't swift. As Arthur spoke with James and Emily about family matters, she found herself reflecting on who she was and what truly mattered. All her life, she had defined worth by possessions, appearances, and social status. But here was Arthur, a simple man with no luxury to his name, yet carrying a dignity that she could never buy. "I don't know what to say," she admitted sincerely. "I was so blinded by my own ideas, by my prejudices." Arthur smiled, that calm smile that seemed to be his signature. What matters is what we do after we realize that. The choices we make going forward. Eleanor took a deep breath. For the first time, she felt the weight of change starting to take shape inside her. That arrogance, which once felt natural and justified, now seemed like a useless barrier between herself and the people around her. In the days following the cafe meeting, Eleanor Carrington couldn't stop thinking about Arthur Weston. Every memory of that moment, his calm gaze, his serene words, haunted her like a shadow. She had spent her life believing that her social status and wealth defined who she was. But Arthur, with his humility and dignity, had shattered that illusion with a disarming simplicity. Eleanor, who had always walked with her head held high, now found herself questioning every action, every arrogant thought she had held for years. For the first time in a long while, she began to see the people around her differently. Her judgmental stares, once automatic and indifferent, now carried a weight of reflection. What truly determined a person's worth? Was it money, appearance, social class? She had always thought so, but Arthur had shown her there was something deeper, something she had never considered. The following week, while having dinner with her daughter, Emily, Eleanor asked about James and inevitably about Arthur. She wanted to know more about the man, his life, his struggles. What made him so different? Emily, unaware of the incident on the plane, spoke of him with affection and respect, only making Eleanor feel the impact of her actions even more. She began to realize how she had built walls around herself, walls that had isolated her from people like Arthur, people who had so much more to offer than she could have ever imagined. She remembered how easily he had forgiven her arrogance, without a hint of hesitation. He hadn't treated her with resentment or used that moment to humiliate her in return. Instead, Arthur had been everything she couldn't be: kind, compassionate, and above all, human. One day, Eleanor decided she needed to do something about it. The guilt she felt wouldn't simply fade over time. She needed to make amends in some way. So she gathered her courage and called Emily, asking her to arrange another meeting with James and Arthur. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew she had to face her mistakes head-on. When the meeting finally took place, on a sunny afternoon at the same cafe in London, Eleanor was nervous. Arthur, as usual, greeted her with a calm and welcoming smile. Eleanor took a deep breath, and before the small talk could unfold, decided she needed to say what she had been holding back. "Arthur, I need you to know that what happened on the plane, I've never felt more ashamed of anything in my life," she said, her words laden with sincerity. "You've taught me something no one else ever has, and for that, I thank you." Arthur, as always, nodded without a trace of bitterness. "I'm glad something good came from a bad situation." Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if in that moment, part of the burden she had been carrying began to dissolve. A few weeks after that second meeting, Eleanor Carrington walked through the streets of London feeling like a different person. Her interactions with Arthur Weston had sparked a transformation within her that she could no longer ignore. The walls her pride and arrogance had built were beginning to crumble, and for the first time in years, she felt a genuine connection to the people around her. Eleanor was no longer the woman who walked through airports or cafes with her head held high in arrogance. Something inside her had changed, a subtle but profound shift. She began to notice the value in things that had once seemed invisible. The smile of a stranger, the simplicity of a kind gesture, the quiet effort of those who worked without recognition. All those things that had once seemed irrelevant now held new meaning. However, Eleanor knew that true transformation wasn't just about changing her thoughts, but also her actions. She began getting involved with local causes, finding ways to give back and support communities she had previously ignored. Her days of superficiality and arrogance were behind her. Now, she wanted her life to have a greater purpose, something that would connect her to people in a meaningful way. And in each of those steps, the memory of Arthur was present. Not because he had demanded it or even expected it, but because, with his simplicity and humility, he had taught her a lesson that all of Eleanor's wealth and privilege could never have provided. One day, Eleanor decided she needed to speak with Arthur again, not to apologize, but to share her gratitude. She found him in a small park in London, where he liked to take walks on sunny days. The soft breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, creating a peaceful atmosphere. "Arthur," she said as she spotted him sitting on a bench, "I wanted to thank you, not just for forgiving me, but for showing me what truly matters." Arthur, with his calm smile, looked at her. "What truly matters isn't what we own, but how we choose to live and treat others." Those words stayed with Eleanor. She knew she would never forget Arthur's humility, and more importantly, she knew it had changed her forever. As the two walked through the park, Eleanor finally felt something she had been seeking for a long time. Peace. Not peace with the world around her, but peace with herself. And that, she realized, was the true gift Arthur had given her. Today, we followed the journey of Arthur Weston and Lady Eleanor Carrington, two people from completely different worlds who crossed paths in the most unexpected way. What began as an encounter filled with arrogance and prejudice ended with a powerful lesson in humility and redemption. Eleanor, once trapped by her beliefs about status and wealth, discovered that the true value of a person lies not in appearances, but in how we choose to treat others. This story reminds us that often the greatest lessons come from where we least expect them, and that empathy and respect are what truly define who we are. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Join us for more stories like this, full of emotion and life lessons. Thank you for being with us, and don't forget to check out the next video that's showing on your screen now.